Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on the Coach Dave Lamar Ultimate YouTube channel. My name is Luke Whitehead and we're going to be going through this week's daily races on LMU. Let's see what this week has in store. So, we're doing it in a slightly different order this week. We're going to look at the ELMS Sprint Cup first of all. So, for this week we've got Bahrain outer layout as the circuit. So, very fun track, another short one like we had at Qatar Short last week. But also very technical, with a very tricky chicane in the middle sector. Which we will go over in the Delta app once we get there. But let's go through the lap overall. So, coming down towards turn 1, you want to brake just after the 150 meter board. So, use this tarmac on the left. Brake around it, depending on the car. Some cars you can brake after, some cars you have to brake before. The Ferrari, you pretty much brake as you get to it. Use the outside curb on the left to slow the car down a bit. This is only really applicable for certain cars, like the Ferrari, for example, you really use it, but in the Mustang, I tend not to. So, go down to gear 1. Be careful not to hook too much of this inside curb, but try and hook it because it does help you rotate the car around the corner. But if you take too much, you can get a yellow, so be very careful. Then back on the throttle, on the exit, using the TC, keeping the car relatively far to the right-hand side, making sure not to run too far out to the left. And you can see we're roughly in the middle of the circuit as we're making our way into the left. Now, you've got to try and take it flat through here, but take a short shift up because you're very traction limited through here. Hit the left-hand curb, but again, don't take too much because you will invalidate. And use this exit curb, but again, not too much because it can inhibit traction. And then coming up to turn, well, what is technically turn 4, you brake just before the 100 meter board, down to gear 1 briefly, and then short shift up to gear 2. Being really crucial to hook on this right-hand curb because you want to keep the car as far to the right-hand side as you can on the exit to set up the very traction-limited left-hander as we enter the outer layout. You can see we hook over this left-hand curb, keeping the car, again, quite far to the left-hand side, bringing it over, not too far because otherwise you'll be off the rubber, you'll be on the marbles on the outside. And now, for the hardest part of the track, in my opinion, is this triple chicane. So you want to try and hook the car around on the right hand side, not too much because the car can side a lot. Being careful to keep half throttle or at least a bit of throttle on to stabilise the rear. And then once you get to this tarmac patch here, then you start thinking about slowing the car down. You can see starting to lift off the throttle and then making sure the car is dead straight as we're braking. Down to gear 2, flicking the car quite aggressively over the first curb, getting the throttle as we hit the curb. And then basically dancing on the throttle through that corner. So you're very traction limited around this track. There's not a lot of grip through that chicane. Especially since on this daily race this week, we're on medium grip. So the track is a lot less grippy than what it usually is. So that's something to really bear in mind, that you are going to be a lot more limited with grip than you would normally be. And then we're letting the car run out on the exit, but again, not too far because the sand or the dust on the left-hand side, the yellow sort of material, is very slippery, so be very mindful of that. And now, let's have a look at how that looks on the Delta software. Okay, as promised, let's have a look at Coach Dave Delta. So, what we wanted to look at was that middle chicane, so let's head down there now. As you can see here, we're dancing around on the throttle a heck of a lot through this long right-hander. Because if you try and keep it flat, you're just going to be understeering wide, and you're going to set yourself up really poorly for that left-right chicane loop. And you can see we're making sure the car is as straight as possible. You can see on the GPS there, the car is travelling relatively straight while we're on the brake. And then as soon as we're trying to aggressively turn into the corner, you can see at peak steering, we are actually largely off the brake, only trailing in really until the apex. And then as soon as we're out there, we're using the throttle, turning aggressively to the right-hand side, and again, just not quite able to get straight to full throttle, but still trying to get a bit of power through because it's faster than coasting all the way. And in addition to that, obviously, the throttle does help to stabilise the rear, especially mid-engined cars such as the Ferrari, so that is something to bear in mind, that you might need to use a bit of throttle to stabilise the car on that transition, especially with the medium grip being a little more sketchy than is normally the case. So let's get back to the actual lap guide. Welcome back, and now we've only got one corner left to do actually, and it's a deceptively difficult last corner, because after that entire lap where you've had to be very precise, you've got a very difficult downhill braking zone at very high speed. So whereas in the normal track you'd probably brake at the 100 meter board, just under the gantry or alongside the curb, you want to brake just before the curb. So you see we start lifting and then we brake about half a car length before the curb. Down to gear 2. Being very smooth. Just hooking the inside curb a little bit. Don't obviously take too much because you'll either get a warning or you'll just bog. So we do take a little bit of the red and white. And back on the throttle as we exit the curb. Letting the car run out nice and wide but to the white line. Not quite on the exit curb. In fact, I tell a lie. We're slightly rubbing it. But again, not really a significant amount of curb being used because it's a very rough anti-cut. And it's the trend of a lot of curbs on this Bahrain circuit, even the outer layout. The curbs are brutal, so make sure you have a TC override button mapped to use on those exit curbs or you'll lose time. And that is a race lap for ELMS Sprint Cup at Bahrain Outer. So, as is always the case with ELMS Sprint, it's 2 times fuel, 40-minute race, so it will probably be a one-stop. I would advise lifting and coasting, especially when the ELMS NMP2 and the NMP3s come around to lap you, which they will at this track. There's a big pace difference here, despite it being a very short track. And obviously, track limits, extremely difficult with this outer layout. The alt layouts tend to have more difficult, more strict track limits than the regular layouts, so that's always something to bear in mind as well. As for car options, you're honestly quite open. Obviously, it's quite a short track, so there's not a huge gap between all the cars. But from what I've seen, the BMW seems very strong here, surprisingly enough, since it just has raw power. Same with the Mustang, same with the Corvette as well, seems very strong. But in general, you're quite open for choice. So just choose what the car suits you and which is most consistent through that very difficult chicane. So. So, for WEC Experience this week, we are at Spa-Francorchamps. So, open setup, multi-class with hypercars, at a very long circuit. So, let's get into it. So, going down towards turn 1, we want to use this 100-meter board or the Total Energies board, whichever one is more alive. It's probably going to be the 100-meter board. We use that as a braking point. Brake just after it, down to gear 1. And then basically trailing all the way to the apex, only getting on the throttle once we hit this inside curb. Then back on the throttle. And it's very crucial to get a good exit there because your exit dictates all your speed up through Eau Rouge and Radion and up down the Camel Street. So, and here we go through Eau Rouge. I don't get the line quite right. I turned inside too early, hit this inside curb, which caused me to understeer a little bit. But in the end, it's all about just keeping the car smooth through there. That's the most important thing. And I'll actually go back and show you what I mean by that. So, first things first, as opposed to ACC, where you take all of the inside curb and some of the grass, this you cannot. You can't take any of the AstroTurf either, since it's slightly lower down. I'll try and see if you can actually see that. And you kind of can, but not really. It's just a massive bump in the green, so you don't want to hit the green. And you can see we're taking a relatively straight line, as much as we kind of can, not swinging too far to the left before going up to the right, because I can to the car. We are clipping the inside curb. Ideally, we don't really want to. You want to try and just get to the white line, as the curb can induce instability, and you can see it induces a bit of understeer for us here. But crucially, this curb, take it as straight as possible. If you take it while turning, or if you take too much of it, you'll either get a yellow or you'll get a bad bounce. So it's very crucial to take the curb dead straight and let the car run out. If you do feel like you're going to get a bounce or you're on a kind of inferior line, you can run the car out to this AstroTurf here on the right, and it will lose you a few hundredths, but it will keep you out the barrier, which is the most important thing. Fast forward a bit up the Camel. And now, up here, you want to keep an eye on the 100-meter board, the curb, and the Goodyear board on the right-hand side. So you can see that there. Those are the 3 markers that I tend to use. Sometimes the orange barrier, depending on what car you're in. But generally, you just want to brake in line with the Goodyear board or in line with the 100-meter board around that marker. And you can see we brake it just as the Goodyear board goes out of screen. Training the car in, trying to hook this inside curb, because this inside curb really helps with rotation. If you miss the inside curb, you will just slide wide. So try and aim to hook it on the green as well, but don't, as I say, don't take too much, because it's very easy to get track limits through here, especially on strict track limits. Same for this curb, you want to hook the inside curb, but again, if you hook any more than what I'm hooking now, you will probably get a yellow, on track limits. So just be very careful that you are just putting 1 or 2 wheels on the inside of the curb and not, more than that. And again, it's very crucial to keep the car very far to the left-hand side. You can see we're having a bit of a slide, but you can see we're within the middle of the track limit. So we're on the left half of the track, which means that when we go to the right at the end of Lacon, we are pretty much on this entry curb. In fact, we are touching it. So we have the maximum amount of room to get a nice swing through. And you can see we're back on the throttle nice and early before you really get back to the apex. And despite a slight slide, we're able to keep it pinned well within the track limits. So that's very important, is that you want to set up that corner, almost sacrifice the first and second parts just to get a better exit through the third, because you can gain so much time by doing that. And now down to the hairpin, you want to brake just after this entry curb, or almost when your front is in line with this curb on the right hand side. Again, depending on car. We briefly go down to gear 1 just to help engine braking. You kind of view this corner off, so go slightly wider of the apex. You can see we're about half a car width out from the inside of the curb. Short shift to get better traction, back on the throttle, and then get the car right over to the right hand side. Use this entry curb to aid your space. Down to gear 2. Aim for this inside curb because it does hook you round, but don't hit the sausage because it will bounce you out onto the gravel on the outside. See when we get it just right, giving ourselves all of the space to work with on the exit, and only just running out almost to the gravel, but not quite, right on the edge of the excursion there. So we kept it within track limits, and that's crucial. But just bear in mind that if you do go on the gravel, you will lose a bit of time. You might not necessarily get a yellow, but it's suboptimal, so try and avoid it if you can. And now into the hardest corner on the circuit. Puon, it just feels like you're waiting the whole time into here. You can see we dub the brakes down a gear, and then we're coasting all the way through here. And then we get back on the throttle only after the corner. Just because the car is so sketchy on a open setup. So that's one thing to bear in mind. As this is an open setup race, the car will be a lot more sketchy than a fixed setup. So you need to be a lot more patient and a lot more smooth on your inputs than you would otherwise need to be. So just bear that in mind, that you cannot attack the corners as much as you can on a fixed setup or a safe setup. And now coming into Piff Puff, you brake at the curb or just under the gantry, whichever reference you prefer. Let the car roll through, trailing off quite early. Try and aim to nibble this inside curb, but not too much, because if you take the green or the checkerboard, the car will just slide and be unstable and you'll lose a lot of time. But ideally, you want to just touch the red and yellow ever so slightly. And then back on the throttle. Short shift up to third for the second part. Then you do want to aim to get the checkerboard, because it really helps you hook the corner. And keep within track limits here, because you don't want to run out onto this gravel. And then bring the car across nice and early for Stavolo. Brake just before the entry curb starts. Down a gear, again trailing off nice and early, let the car roll through. And then after we get to the green part of the curb, you wait a little bit longer and then back on the throttle. Because if you try and go on too early, you'll understeer onto the gravel. So again, very difficult to get the track right, because you have a lot less space to work with than you would on, say, ACC or iRacing in some corners. Then you should be flat through here if you take the right trajectory. We have a slight lift because I turned in a little bit too early. And now you get a big old break through Blanchemont, and now to the bus stop. You want to brake at around the Michelin board or the 100-meter board, whichever one survives. It's usually not the Michelin board, to be honest. But brake at the 100-meter board or just before. We brake just right down to gear 1. Use a bit of the entry curb for some space. Then you want to hook the right-hand curb. Ideally, you want to try and turn in a little bit later to the next left. We unfortunately turned in a bit early, so we hit the sausage curb on the left. And you can see we understeer as a result of that. And have to be quite hesitant on the throttle because the car's like bouncing. We have to wait for it to settle. But ideally, you'd want to turn in a little bit later. Still hit the inside curb, but not the sausage. And then be back on the throttle and use all of this track on the exit. For some reason, this track limit is very, very lenient, so you can go this far off. And I would very much advise it because you are so traction limited out of there, and you want to try and get to the throttle as fast as possible. So that is a lap of Spa on race fuel on an open setup. So I just wanted to go over P1 once again, since it's a very unusual corner and the way we took it on this lap is very unusual, but I would recommend it as an approach. Let's go have a look. So data. So P1 is here. So you can see coming into the corner, we're using a bit of the entry curb. You can see we're a quick stab of the brake, very quick, and then we're off the brake. And as I said, we were getting pretty much all the braking done in a straight line. You can see we're just starting to make our way into the corner as we're trailing off the brake right at the end. You can see looking at the GPS. But then all the way through the actual cornering phase until after the apex, we're completely coasting. Letting the car do its thing, letting the car rotate naturally. Because if you try and do too much through P1, the car will just destabilize and be very snappy. The only thing I'd probably advise is maybe use a bit of the throttle to stabilize the car, but not too much. You can see one of the reference apps does that. Because if you do it too much, you'll just understeer off the track. So be very careful that if you do have a bit of a snap on with the rear end, you can use a bit of throttle to stabilize the car, but not too much. And you can see then we're back on the throttle only when we know we're not going to understeer off track and that we're not going to take the throttle back off again. So let's go through some tips and tricks we have for WEC Experience at Spa this week. So as is always the case, 40-minute race, multi-class with hypercars. So obviously the hypercars are significantly faster than the GT3s. So be very careful, especially through Sector 2 where it's quite narrow. You're going to have to be very cautious with them coming up on you. You know what the hypercars are sometimes like. They can get a little bit impatient if they're in a battle. So just prioritize self-preservation in that section because it's already hard enough to negotiate in Sector 2 in the GT3s. Also, 40-minute race, as I mentioned, it's going to be a no-stop. So just make sure that you remember that and have enough energy and fuel to do the whole distance. As for car choice, the McLaren and the Porsche seem head and shoulders above the rest. The Lambo seems like a decent shot as well. But those three cars really are the ones to choose, in my opinion. Unfortunately, the front-engine cars don't seem particularly strong at this track. Maybe the Merc is probably the closest to that level out of the front-engine cars. So you're very limited for choice, unfortunately, in terms of super quick cars. But ultimately, just choose the car you're comfortable with, as Spa is extremely difficult to drive on a race fuel. So just bear that in mind. So yeah, happy hunting, and let's roll on to the LMGT3 fixed races. So lastly, we have the LMGT3 fixed races, which are going to be at Monza Curva Grande, so without that first chicane. So rather than the first chicane being a massive chaotic moment for the start of the races, you're going to have to wait a little bit longer, go through Curva Grande, and then that chicane afterwards is going to be where the chaos kicks off. So let's figure out how to do a lap around here. We're on what would be race fuel. I believe it's around 12 or 13 laps. I'd probably put 13 laps in just to be safe for this race. But let's get into it. So going down towards what would be turn 1. Do not brake for this. I think it goes without saying. Remember, do not brake for this because you will get pile driven and it will be the end of your race. And obviously you lose a lot of time on the lap as well. So make sure, do not take the first chicane. Alarms, do not take the do not take it. Turn 1 is going to be Curva Grande, which is a pretty easy flat corner, but the car does move around quite a bit, so be prepared for a bit of movement. Try and keep it as close to the white line as you can without taking the inside curb. We do graze the inside curb, but luckily it doesn't destabilize us too much. Now, coming down to what is the first chicane or first proper corner. You're approaching it at almost 280 kph, maybe more depending on the car you're driving. Brake earlier than you would normally. So normally you'd brake around 100 meter board on the regular layout, but this corner you need to brake. I found that the 150 meter board, the Avis gantry, or the digiboard, which is actually hidden sneakily behind the 150 meter board, they were a pretty good reference for me. So any one of those three, depending on the car, maybe a bit earlier, maybe a bit later, but as a rough baseline, that's as good as you're going to get for this corner. So you can see that we brake pretty much as the digiboard goes out of view. So I'll go into third person to show you that the digiboard is there. There you go. Hello digiboard. Will probably be yellow, given that it's absolute chaos at Monza usually for these daily races. But coming in, we brake at the digiboard as I mentioned. Down to gear 1 for this car. Some cars will take it in a higher gear. Sometimes some cars will take it in gear 1 as well. Just use your initiative for that one. And the good thing is about this chicane, on fixed setup at least, is that you have quite a lot of choice as to what lines you take. You can take both the sausage curbs as long as you don't cut them too much, because the track limits are quite harsh here. But what I actually found was that you can avoid one of the sausage curbs, either the first one or the second one, and you generally get a more consistent result, at least in the Ferrari and a couple of other cars that I tried. You get a more consistent result by avoiding one of the curbs. I found actually that the best line for the Ferrari specifically was to take the first curb like this. So you take the sausage curb, add a bit of throttle just before you hit the sausage curb to get the front a bit off the ground. And then we actually avoid the second curb, because what you tend to get on this sausage curb on the right hand side is a really bad bounce, because it's quite a heavy curb. You need to be really precise with the line and the trajectory you take. And if you don't take it exactly millimetrically perfect, the car will just bounce. So generally, especially in race trim where you're not going to want to shave every single millisecond off, I find it more consistent and probably safer to avoid the second sausage curb. So depending on the car, that is something I would definitely experiment, and probably something I would use if I'm not afraid to lose half a tenth or so on the midpoint of the corner to maybe gain more on the exit. And as you can see, really smooth exit. We keep comfortably in the track limits. Don't even need to use the gravel on the left-hand side. We just keep our left wheels on the AstroTurf. And, you see how clean that is. As opposed to taking the curves where you're bouncing and having to basically delay getting on the throttle because of how the car's responding. And now, into the Lesmos. You want to take it sort of braking at around the orange wall. I use that as at least a reference. So depending on the car, you can brake after it goes off screen or just as you kind of approach it. And in this car specifically, just as I approach the orange part of the wall is when I start to brake. And you can see, being very patient, kind of how we saw at Spa earlier in the video, letting the car do its thing, and then back on the throttle, almost exactly as you get to this tarmac access road, or this orange barrier, whichever works. Again, this is also car dependent, but I find that this is a relatively consistent formula for a lot of the cars. Just wait until the car is through, 2/3 of the corner before getting on the throttle. Because then that means you can keep comfortably with inside track limits. And again, these track limits are brutal through the two Lesmos. So it's very easy to actually go off. So be very, very careful and err on the side of caution on the exits to make sure that you validate your laps and don't get a penalty in the race. And now second Lesmo, I use... So there's a massive pole on the right-hand side, which you can kind of see. There you go. It's the telegraph pole. So I use that and the 50-meter board as my reference. They're not quite in line to kind of go between them. And you can see we actually brake at the 50-meter board, but sometimes they won't be applicable, so you have two references there that can work. Again, in third gear, similar situation to the first Lesmo, despite it being a much shorter apex corner. You wait until you get to the apex before getting on the throttle because of that exit curve being very brutal. And you can see we keep comfortably within the track limits. Two wheels on the anti-cut, and that's all we need. And then you have a long run up towards Ascari. So that exit is particularly important because Ascari, if you're brave enough, is quite a good overtaking opportunity. And now, braking just after, or just before the 100-meter board, or just after this exit road on the right-hand side. Down to gear 2 briefly for engine braking, but most cars will keep it in gear 3. And you can see trailing until we get to the curb. Again, short shift just for traction. Back on the throttle just after we exit this curb, because if you try and go any earlier, you'll understeer onto the outside curb, or you'll just have a slide. So just to make the car, stable before you get on the throttle, because I think it's important not to overwhelm the car, especially on fixed setup, because you're on low wing. That is the important thing at Monza, is that you're on low wing, so you don't want to overwhelm the car and do too much, because it will bite back twice as hard as it would at a track, for example, like Imola, or Bahrain, for example. And then you can see we have to take a slight lift, because otherwise we'd understeer really wide. It's key to keep on this right-hand curb as much as possible to set up your exit for the left, since that curb on the left is very brutal and you want to take it at the right angle. And you can see we get it absolutely spot on. We get a nice smooth exit, which keeps us well within the track limits again here, which, it's very easy to extend the track limits in Monza, and we keep it well within there. And now, one last corner. Come down, brake at the digiboard on the left-hand side. or just after it goes out of view, down to gear 2, coasting again at the apex, short shift up for traction again, and then back on the throttle pretty much as we get to the midpoint of the corner, and we can start to see this access road appear. And then back on the throttle, we let the car run out, but not too far, because we want to keep a relatively short line to the start-finish line. Dragging the car back over to the right-hand side for the shortest possible line, and that is a lap of Monza Curva Grande. So, what things do we need to consider for the LMGT3 fixed races at Monza Curva Grande this week? So, first and foremost, I've seen it so many times. Do not brake for turn 1 like you would normally at the regular layout. I've seen so many times someone qualifies on the front row or even in the mid-pack, and they just think, oh, I've got to brake for turn 1. And they slam the brakes and cause a mass crash. Don't be that person. Please don't be that person. I've seen it so many times. Curva Grande's turn 1, you keep it flat through the cut through. Keep it pinned. But also be aware of people forgetting that as well. So be a little bit wary, especially earlier in the week, of people making that mistake. Second of all, 20-minute race, fixed setup, pretty straightforward. I think 13 or so laps should be perfectly fine. 50% energy with the regular fuel ratio should be more than safe, if my maths is correct. Car choice, anything with low wing, anything with good top speed. So the Lexus, BMW, McLaren historically has been very good here. Lamborghini should be pretty decent. Even the Ferrari seems to have pretty decent top speed since I looked at the setup and it's pretty low wing. But just be wary that it is very difficult over the chicane curbs. So if you're willing to sacrifice a bit of drivability, the Ferrari could still be a good shoe-in for the races. So yeah, happy hunting, guys. And I hope you guys enjoy the fixed races. So, that's it for this week of Le Mans Ultimate Daily Races. I've been Luke Whitehead on the Coach Dave Le Mans Ultimate YouTube channel, and I hope you found this guide helpful. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you're new, drop any comments down below if you have any questions or suggestions for videos you might want to see, and happy hunting. I'll see you on track. Take care.